Gulf air in summer is heavy enough to swallow a man whole. It slicks the skin and clings to the lungs, a damp weight that never fully lifts. In 19th century Mobile, Alabama, that heat mixed with the smell of river mud, tar from shipyards, and something darker, the sweat and sorrow of a city built on human bondage. Along the riverfront, enslaved people unloaded cotton and lumber beneath the eyes of overseers. Alongside stately houses shaded by live oaks, enslaved women scrubbed floors until their hands cracked. Mobile prospered on their backs, yet their names vanished from records like mist. Except one name keeps resurfacing, whispered, half erased, yet too unsettling to forget. Abram. His story was not taught in polite parlors. It didn't appear in local newspapers except in vague, nervous lines about a most dreadful occurrence. But among black families, and in the memories of those who lived close enough to smell smoke and hear the panic, Abram's name survived. He was said to be quiet, clever, watchful. And one humid night, after a lifetime of abuse, he struck back. Official papers smothered what happened under euphemism. The city moved on. Yet more than a century later, the tale still unsettles anyone who listens. To understand why, picture Mobile in the 1840s. Cotton was king, and the port was a funnel to the world. Wealthy planters and merchants built fine homes with tall windows to catch river breezes. Behind those homes stretched quarters for the enslaved. Rows of cramped cabins, dirt floors, patched roofs, little protection from mosquitoes or storms. The economy depended on those quarters staying silent. Abram lived in one of them. Records list him only once in a household inventory from 1839. Male, approx, 25 years. No surname. Enslaved people rarely got one. Oral tradition fills in what paper ignores. Abram was tall, with shoulders hardened by shipyard hauling. Some said he was hired out to work the docks, others that he managed horses and wagons for his owner. All agree he learned quickly and remembered every slight. Those close to him believed he could read, a dangerous skill for a man in bondage. Perhaps he picked it up from cast-off newspapers or an Irish dockhand willing to teach letters for a meal. His master, William Harper, fit the mold of Mobile's rising merchant class. Ambitious, proud, quick to temper. Harper owned a modest shipping business and a handful of enslaved laborers. To outsiders, he projected respectability. To those under him, he was harsh and unpredictable. Whippings were common, wages for hired-out work were pocketed by him, and small acts of dignity, keeping family together, claiming an earned Sunday rest, could be snatched away without warning. Abram endured for years. Endurance was survival. The docks taught him how power moved, who paid bribes, who looked away, who kept secrets. He learned that Mobile's polite society prized order above justice. As long as cotton moved and ships sailed, cruelty stayed invisible. Yet people noticed his eyes, always watchful, measuring, never entirely broken. Then came the event no one would detail, but everyone remembered in shadow. One muggy night, some say just after midsummer, others swear it was in early fall. Noise erupted from the Harper household. Shouts. A crash. Then silence. By dawn, the neighborhood swirled with panic. Harper's family was in disarray. Servants ran door to door seeking help. Lawmen arrived grim-faced. Whatever happened inside those walls, it was enough to send shockwaves through a city that prided itself on control. Official accounts called it a shocking disturbance and tragic domestic violence. They never printed Abram's name, only that an enslaved man had vanished into the night after an attack. The language was vague by design. Mobile merchants didn't want headlines about rebellion or vengeance, but private talk was clearer. People whispered that Abram had finally snapped, that after years of exploitation, something in him refused to bend any further. Some said he disappeared into the swamps, aided by free black sailors who slipped him aboard a departing ship. Others believed he died in the woods, hunted but never caught. Either way, he was gone before sunrise patrols could lock down the city. His absence left a void no owner could fill. Fear. For the first time, many masters faced the possibility that their cruelty was not beyond answer. In the quarters, the news moved fast. Enslaved men and women, long denied any image of resistance, found in Abram's flight a dangerous hope. If one man could break free, or at least break the illusion of total control, perhaps others could dream beyond silent endurance. Songs began to carry veiled references, a name tucked into spirituals, a line about the river taking a man who would not bow. For Mobile's elites, this was nightmare. They needed to restore calm, so they rewrote the event. Harper's allies spread stories painting Abram as mad, ungrateful, possessed. Newspapers minimized the facts. Court dockets left blanks where his name should have been. Over time, official history shrank the incident to a footnote. But memory is stubborn when it answers a deep wound. That's why, more than a century later, the outline remains. A man born into chains, forced to labor in a city built on his back, who refused to die quietly. We don't know the exact trigger. A beating, a threat to family, a final humiliation. We don't know his fate, but we know enough to feel the weight of that night. The shock that rolled through streets lined with lanterns and moss. This opening chapter of Abram's story sets the stage for what followed. A city scrambling to maintain order, a community of enslaved people quietly absorbing a rare act of defiance, and a man whose name officials tried to erase, but who endures in whispered legend. It is not a tale of simple heroism. It is raw, frightening, and steeped in the costs of resisting a brutal system. But it is also a window into the cracks in that system, where one person's refusal to submit could ripple far beyond a single household. To understand Abram, you have to understand Mobile in the decades before the Civil War. A port city perched between river and gulf, outwardly genteel and inwardly brutal. By the 1830s and 1840s, it was booming. Cotton from the Black Belt came downriver, lumber floated in from pine forests, ships sailed for New Orleans, Havana, Liverpool. Merchants built wealth quickly, raising columned homes shaded by live oaks and Spanish moss. Behind those houses lay the labor that made the dream. Enslaved men who hauled and loaded, women who washed and cooked, children hired out before they could read. Mobile's elites like to think of themselves as cosmopolitan. They attended balls, invested in shipping lines, and read European newspapers. Yet the social order was enforced with whips and fear. City ordinances restricted movement of enslaved people. Curfews barred them from streets after dark without passes, and patrols hunted runaways. The docks were especially dangerous, crowded, chaotic, full of strangers who might offer escape but just as likely betray a man for reward. Still, the docks were where some enslaved workers learned the wider world existed. Abram's childhood vanished into the fog of slavery's poor record-keeping. He likely came from the rural hinterland. One ledger shows William Harper purchasing a boy Abram, about 12, from a planter upriver. Harper, an ambitious merchant in his 20s, was building a small empire ferrying cotton bales from plantations to ocean-going ships. A boy who could be trained for horses and wagons was an investment. The world Abram entered was harsh. Harper was not a great planter with hundreds of slaves, but a middling striver with something to prove. Such men often ruled their households by temper. Testimony from similar mobile merchants describes strict discipline, long workdays, and punishments meant to show control. A single man owned a handful of people. Losing one meant financial loss, so fear was his insurance. Abram grew tall and strong under this regime. By his late teens, he managed wagon teams hauling cotton to the waterfront, navigating rutted roads, swampy detours, and the complicated dance of port commerce. This made him valuable and vulnerable. Valuable because Harper relied on his skill. Vulnerable because any slip could mean whipping or worse. Harper could hire him out to shipyards and pocket the pay. Sometimes Abram may have worked side by side with free black sailors, Irish immigrants, and Creoles of color, a rare taste of life beyond bondage. These docks were dangerous classrooms. He would have seen men barter, cheat, and bribe officials. He could hear languages from ships bound for faraway ports. He may have caught glimpses of papers, schedules, or even letters, hints of literacy he might later use. Oral memory insists he could read at least a little. Even if only half true, the idea reflects how the community remembered him: observant, intelligent, quietly planning. Life under Harper was not just labor. It was control of every intimate choice. Marriage among the enslaved required owner permission. Families could be broken for debt or whim. Holidays were rationed. Even small dignity, keeping a keepsake, visiting kin, could be revoked. Harper, according to rumors, was volatile. He drank. He lashed out when profits slipped. Some say he beat Abram for questioning a dangerous load. Others tell of insults hurled when Abram asked about wages he'd earned while hired out. None of this is on paper. Masters rarely documented cruelty. But the pattern fits a city where exploitation was normal. Religion saturated Mobile. White planters and merchants attended Episcopal and Baptist churches that preached order and obedience. Black worship was policed. Sermons were expected to emphasize servitude. Yet hush harbors, secret gatherings in woods or cabins, nurtured a different message: survival, hope, coded resistance. Abram may have absorbed both worlds: the piety demanded by Harper's household and the whispered faith of people carving meaning under oppression. Songs carried double meanings: freedom as heaven, but also escape. By his mid-20s, Abram would have understood his position clearly. Crucial to Harper's wealth, yet denied agency. Each trip to the docks showed possibilities: free sailors, bustling commerce, ships slipping out to sea. Each return to Harper's yard reinforced captivity. That tension builds quietly, but relentlessly. Many enslaved men lived whole lives under it. A few reached breaking points. Another element shaped him: community networks. Enslaved workers often traded news, helped each other navigate danger, and sometimes aided escapes. Mobile's port meant contact with free black communities from the Caribbean and North. It also meant patrols and informants. To survive, Abram learned discretion. Watch, listen, reveal little. That reputation for quiet intelligence followed him. The 1840s brought added strain. Cotton markets swung wildly. Small merchants like Harper gambled fortunes on freight and timing. When profits dipped, they squeezed hardest where they could: their enslaved laborers. Abrupt sale threats hung over families. Punishment spiked when frustration boiled. Surviving letters from other merchants complain about insolence and theft, often code for minor resistance like slowing work or saving earnings. It's in such climates that one act of defiance can spark catastrophe. By now, Abram was no boy. He was a man in his prime, deeply familiar with the city's veins: river, alley, warehouse, and marsh. He had endured 2 decades of forced labor. He had watched Harper grow richer while keeping him voiceless. He had seen men like himself whipped for errors, sold south for imagined disloyalty. The slow grind of humiliation carves deep. Then, sometime in the mid-1840s, rumors spread of a decisive humiliation. One account says Harper threatened to sell Abram downriver, a terrifying fate, sending him deeper into the Cotton Belt's brutal fields. Another says Harper struck him in public at the wharf, calling him worthless before other workers. Both could be true or neither. The record is fog. What matters is the sense, preserved in oral history, that Abram's breaking point came after one final, dehumanizing blow. It is important to pause and understand that enslaved resistance often happened in small, hidden ways: sabotage, flight, subtle defiance. Open confrontation was rare and perilous, yet sometimes it erupted when a life narrowed to nothing but suffering. Abram's world offered no legal redress, no protection, no escape hatch beyond running, itself deadly risky. To imagine his choices is to glimpse the cruelty of a system designed to crush autonomy. By the time whispers say he began to change, quieter still, more withdrawn, eyes burning with some private resolve, the die may have been cast. Neighbors later recalled sensing tension in Harper's yard. Enslaved women warned each other to stay clear when tempers flared. A free black drayman claimed years later that Abram asked odd questions about ship departures, tides, and swampland routes. Whether this meant planning to flee or something darker, no one then could know. This is the world that produced the man who would vanish into myth one hot night. A world where cotton wealth masked everyday brutality, where a single merchant's rage could shape a man's fate, where a port city connected to freedom yet guarded its chains fiercely. To understand what came next, the night Mobile tried to forget. You must feel that pressure. Decades of forced labor, intelligence wasted, dignity denied, doors to safety barred. Abram Faye's story is less about one sudden act than about a lifetime that made such an eruption inevitable. By the mid-1840s, Abram's life had narrowed to a hard edge. He was strong, skilled, and trusted enough to move goods and oversee teams, but still treated as property. Harper's fortune swung with the cotton market. When business soured, Abram felt the lash of his frustration. Each reversal brought fresh threats: sale, punishment, the tearing apart of any fragile ties Abram had built with other enslaved people. His value to Harper kept him near, but never safe. People who later whispered his name often described a change that year. He became even quieter, but not meek. He moved with a deliberate stillness that some found unnerving. He asked questions, not reckless ones, just enough to learn. Ship schedules, the layout of swamps west of town, which patrols drank and which stayed alert. A free black stevedore remembered being asked, casually, how far the nearest abolition-sympathetic captain might carry a man if the price were right. Nothing in these questions was illegal by itself, but taken together they suggested a man probing for exits. Tension also rose in Harper's household. The merchant's business stumbled when a shipment of cotton spoiled in a late storm. He blamed everyone beneath him. Abram, responsible for hauling, was a convenient target. One version of the story says Harper docked his food rations as punishment. Another says he beat him in front of hired Irishmen to prove authority. The event, whatever its details, spread quickly through the quarters and the docks. Abram took it, one later account says, but his eyes went somewhere else. At the same time, the city itself was uneasy. The 1840s brought rumors of uprisings from other parts of the South, though most were swiftly crushed. White mobilians tightened patrols, fearing revolt. Curfews grew harsher. New laws restricted literacy among the enslaved. To merchants like Harper, this was reassurance. To people like Abram, it was one more wall closing in. Survival strategies shrank as control grew. Yet within this clampdown, tiny resistances flourished. Enslaved dockworkers delayed loads by misplacing ropes. Women shared food secretly. Some forged passes to move at night. Songs carried double meanings. Spirituals about deliverance that also charted routes. Abram lived inside this coded world. Oral memory insists he learned to read river signs, currents, tides, and marsh paths, and that he had friends willing to shelter a fugitive for a night. Whether he planned flight or something more confrontational, no one can say. But his knowledge deepened. Another layer of pressure was family. Some accounts suggest Abram had a partner, perhaps an enslaved woman hired in from another household. They may have shared a child. Sale threatened to split them. In the slave South, such separation was routine, but each case carved its own wound. One tale passed down says Harper threatened to sell Abram down the river, meaning into the deep cotton South where work was harsher and escape nearly impossible. Others say the threat included selling his partner and child separately. Even if embellished, the story reflects a common truth. Sale was a weapon of total control. Witnesses noticed Abram's temper harden, but not flare. He didn't shout. He stopped joking. He worked with a precision that felt like withdrawal. One elderly man, interviewed decades later, described him as already gone inside himself, like a man who's left, but his body ain't caught up. This kind of psychic exit, retreat before an uncertain leap, was familiar to those who, de-seen friends, plan escapes. Small acts signaled his quiet resistance. Once, when Harper ordered an impossible overnight delivery, Abram delayed just enough to cost him a contract. Another time, he refused to whip a younger boy for a mistake, taking punishment himself. These were dangerous choices, subtle but visible statements that he would not be weaponized against his own people. Each risked severe retaliation, yet Abram seemed beyond fear. Around this time, new opportunity and new danger arrived with visiting ships. Sailors from the North and the Caribbean trafficked not just goods, but rumors. Abolition, freedom, passage to places beyond the Gulf. Such talk was deadly if overheard, but to someone desperate, it could be a lifeline. Abram's dock work put him near these whispers. A single overheard plan, a ship leaving at night, a sympathetic cook, might be enough to tempt a break. Meanwhile, Harper's household tightened. Some suggest he sensed Abram slipping from control and doubled efforts to crush him. More beatings, more public humiliation. Threats of sale increased. His wife reportedly urged that Abram be rid of before he infects others with boldness. Neighbors noticed tension but looked away. Challenging a man's control over his property was taboo. All this brewed in a climate of general fear. Patrols roamed. Rumor painted any assertive black man as a rebel. A minor disturbance could bring brutal crackdowns. Yet fear cuts both ways. White residents feared open rebellion. Enslaved people feared annihilation, but also saw how panic unsettled their masters. Into this balance walked Abram, increasingly sure he had nothing left to lose. Then came what later stories call the last straw. Accounts diverge but agree it happened late summer. Some say Harper tried to sell Abram's partner and child while keeping him. Some say he beat Abram nearly to death after a dispute over dock fees. Others that Harper humiliated him publicly in front of sailors. No record survives, only the certainty that a final humiliation broke something inside a man already cornered. Afterward, witnesses describe eerie calm. Abram returned to work, but silent, eyes flat and far away. He avoided unnecessary talk. He was seen watching the river often, standing alone at dusk where marsh met shipping lane. Fellow dockhands sensed danger but could do nothing. To warn him or report him were both deadly choices. Some later said they wished they'd urged flight. Others thought he was beyond persuasion. By early autumn, the household's tension was palpable. Harper, still losing money, drank more. His violence grew erratic. The quarters whispered of an impending sale. Patrols, meanwhile, hunted for rumors of revolt, but found none. They looked for loud meetings, not solitary resolve. Abram's defiance by then was invisible, not riot or speech, but a man quietly rejecting the lie of permanent helplessness. That is what terrified masters most. Not shouting, but silence filled with decision. In a system built on submission, a single person reaching that state was a spark in dry timber. When later generations whispered his name, they described this phase as the gathering storm. Everyone knew something was coming, though no one knew what. And when the night finally came, the one newspaper softened into tragic disturbance. Those who watched him withdraw were not surprised. Shocked by the audacity, yes, but not by the inevitability. This is how uprisings are born under total domination. Not in crowds, but in one man's quiet resolve formed by years of cruelty, loss, and thwarted dignity. The legend of Abram of Mobile begins not with the mysterious night itself, but with these final weeks, the slow, silent gathering of a man ready to refuse a system that gave him no other path. The night Abram vanished began like so many others along the Mobile River. Thick heat clinging after sunset, the buzz of insects, faint lantern light behind shuttered windows. To neighbors it was an ordinary evening. To those inside Harper's household it was heavy with unspoken dread. Weeks of humiliation had ground down the enslaved man who managed Harper's wagons. Sale threats hung in the air. Harper had been drinking again, angry at losses and searching for someone to punish. The house simmered with tension. Some details come from oral history, passed cautiously through families. They say Abram moved with calm that day, fulfilling orders without a word, his expression unreadable. He was seen alone near the river at dusk, staring out as if weighing distance and tide. Another said he quietly gathered small things, a scrap of cloth, maybe a tool. Nothing that would draw notice, but enough to feed rumor later that he was preparing to leave for good. What happened once night fell was never fully recorded. Official documents reduce it to a violent disturbance in the Harper home. A brief article in the Mobile Register called it a shocking affair which decimated a household and saw an enslaved man abscond. It gave no name, no motive, no description beyond deadly assault. That vagueness was deliberate. Merchants wanted calm, planters wanted to reassure themselves that order held. Yet neighborhood memory tells more, though still in fragments. Shouts broke the midnight quiet. Dogs howled, then fell silent. A neighbor later said she woke to the sound of running feet and slammed shutters in fear. Soon after, smoke or lantern glow was seen around the Harper yard. Some say from a struggle, others from panicked lights. By dawn, part of the household was in chaos, several injured, one possibly dead, and Abram gone. Law moved quickly to control the narrative. Patrols swept the streets but found no sign of him. The sheriff's brief report, a single surviving page, labels the event an incident of insubordination resulting in casualties. It notes that the perpetrator escaped under cover of darkness, believed aided by outside elements. That was bureaucratic shorthand for a man they could not catch and a truth they did not want public, that an enslaved person had turned the master's violence back on them and disappeared. Harper himself survived but was badly shaken. Some said he was wounded, others that shock and shame silenced him. Within days, he closed his shipping yard temporarily, hiring guards and warning other merchants about subversive elements. Behind those words was fear. If one man could strike inside the walls of a white household, what else was possible? Among the enslaved, news spread like fire through dry grass. In quarters and back alleys, people whispered that Abram had done what many only dreamed, refused to die quietly. Details changed with each retelling. Some said he fought his way free, others that allies spirited him away by boat before dawn. The truth mattered less than the meaning. A man with no power had shaken the order of things. Mobile's black community understood the danger of this story, but also its power. Spirituals and work songs soon carried veiled references. A man crossing water, a man who would not bow. These weren't open anthems, too risky, but coded hope. For people trapped in bondage, Abram became proof that submission wasn't the only fate. White society reacted with predictable control. Newspapers downplayed everything, framing the event as senseless violence by a deranged slave. Some merchants demanded stricter patrols, harsher bans on literacy and movement. Preachers thundered about obedience. Harper's allies whispered that he'd been too lenient, that generosity toward slaves invited rebellion. It was safer to call Abram mad than admit he acted from reason and accumulated injury. Yet fear leaked through the calm facade. Merchants installed more locks. Patrols doubled for months. Some households sold off men they feared might follow Abram's path. Behind the push to erase him was anxiety. If his story spread unfiltered, it could spark more resistance. Harper never fully recovered his standing. His business limped on but never regained momentum. Some said he feared his own workers after that night, keeping them under tighter guard but avoiding direct confrontations. He died years later, his shipping firm swallowed by larger players. Family papers, what survive, mention the incident only obliquely, as if shame lingered. Abram himself vanished utterly. Patrols searched swamps and docks, questioned free black sailors, and posted rewards, but no trace appeared. One theory says he reached a ship bound for the Caribbean or North and slipped into freedom under a new name. Another believes he perished in the Delta's unforgiving marshes. Either way, he eluded recapture long enough to unsettle the city's sense of control. And that was enough to etch his name in quiet memory. For decades, his story lived underground. Grandmothers told it in whispers, a warning about cruelty's cost, a flicker of hope that bondage wasn't absolute. Field hands sang about a man who walked on water, code for escaping unseen. Urban free blacks passed on the caution to be smart, to know the docks as Abram had. Meanwhile, official Mobile moved on, records buried or lost, the event reduced to a footnote. Slave insurrection suppressed. But legends are stubborn when they answer a need. In the Great Migration, black families leaving Alabama carried fragments north. Writers collecting spirituals in the 1930s noted verses about Abram's night. Folklorists puzzled over a story of a dock worker who refused submission and disappeared. None could find archives, but the oral threads were strong. To understand this moment is to feel both its danger and its promise. It was not triumph. Abram's act brought retaliation, fear, and surely cost him his home, maybe his life. But it was rupture. In a world built on certainty that the enslaved would endure forever, one man proved otherwise. That breach could be patched but not forgotten. The night also shows how power controls narrative. By refusing to print his name or details, Mobile tried to erase the lesson. Violence was framed as madness, rebellion as chaos, so masters could sleep again. Yet the silence left room for whisper networks to fill with their own meaning. Courage, resistance, possibility. More than 175 years later, the lack of record forces us to listen differently. To songs, gossip, family lore. These are not courtroom transcripts, but they preserve an emotional truth. That people saw in Abram both the cost of oppression and the flicker of autonomy no system can fully kill. This was the turning point of his life and his legend. After this night, Abram belonged no longer to Harper, but to story. He ceased being an entry in a ledger and became a caution, a symbol, a shadow haunting Mobile's history. The enslaved man who dared strike back and vanished before dawn. Morning broke over Mobile to a city rattled but determined to appear calm. The official response was quick and calculating. Patrols scoured riverbanks, marsh trails, and wagon roads, but with no clear trail, they turned to intimidation. Households were searched. Free black residents were questioned. Anyone caught aiding runaways risked fines, prison, or sail south. The message was clear. Whatever had happened inside the Harper home would not become a pattern. Yet for all their patrols, the authorities found nothing. Abram had vanished. His absence itself became a wound in the city's sense of control. To lose a man so intimately tied to the docks, someone they assumed fully contained, undermined the idea that the system was airtight. It was a small breach, but it spread unease. Among Mobile's enslaved people, the effect was electric but complicated. Some felt a rush of dangerous pride. One of their own had refused to endure forever. Others felt fear. Masters' reprisals often swept up the innocent. Whisper networks pulsed with conflicting advice. Some urged keeping heads down until white anger cooled. Others quietly circulated tips, safer hiding spots in swamps, ways to find friendly sailors, routes north through New Orleans. In Harper's household, the shock curdled into paranoia. Surviving records, mostly letters from his business contacts, suggest a man humiliated. One wrote that Harper had allowed insolence to fester and must now tighten discipline. Another urged him to sell off his remaining men and replace them. Harper kept his business but withdrew from social events for months. He increased surveillance of his workers, hired extra guards, and avoided traveling without white companions. For a man once confident in his mastery, the reversal was profound. Mobile's white elite closed ranks. Within weeks, newspapers shifted from vague alarm to firm reassurance. Articles reframed the event as an isolated outbreak of slave madness. Editors stressed the loyalty of the city's black labor force and the swift action of patrols. Churches preached about obedience, citing scripture to warn enslaved congregants against wicked rebellion. The narrative hardened. Abram was an aberration, dangerous but meaningless in the grand scheme. Order, they insisted, held firm. But under that public calm ran private fear. Merchants wrote each other about increasing insolence. Some lobbied the city council for stricter night patrols and heavier fines for anyone teaching slaves to read. Families with valuable male slaves began selling them to plantations farther inland, hoping to avoid similar trouble. This reshuffling caused quiet heartbreak in the quarters, tearing apart couples and friends. Another ripple of punishment from one man's stand. For the enslaved community, the memory shifted from immediate danger to long-term myth. Older men counseled caution but told the story to the young. Abram, the wagon driver who knew the river and did not bow. Mothers used it as warning and hope that cruelty could drive a man to desperate freedom, but also that such defiance carried terrible risk. Songs encoded his name in lines about midnight water and chains breaking under tide. These weren't open anthems. They were private reminders that bondage, though crushing, was not destiny. Outside Mobile, the event barely registered. Planters elsewhere had no interest in publicizing successful resistance. Shipping records show no disruption beyond Harper's brief business troubles. For a slave society, silence was strategy. Better to bury a single rupture than risk it inspiring more. But as black families migrated, some later freed, some escaping, they carried the story north. Snippets appear in WPA interviews from the 1930s, elders recalling a man in Mobile who fought and ran, a shadow who slipped away before the sun. The legal system handled the incident by pretending it wasn't political. Surviving docket notes list no rebellion charge, only a dead-end entry about property absconded after attack. This bureaucratic erasure turned a moment of resistance into a paperwork anomaly. For white Mobile, that was enough. They could tell themselves it was madness, not defiance, chaos, not reason. But erasure is never complete. Every time a dock worker glanced at the river and wondered about escape, every time an old song hummed about a man who walked into darkness and was not seen again, the legend breathed. It gave shape to feelings that had no legal outlet: anger, hope, refusal. For Harper's household, the fallout lingered. He rebuilt business slowly but never regained full confidence. Letters hinted debts, lost contracts, and strained alliances. He died in the 1850s, still a merchant but diminished. His family avoided discussing the incident. Later generations seemed to know only that trouble once struck their ancestors' home. For Abram, we know nothing concrete after that night. Maybe he boarded a ship bound for Havana or New York under cover of darkness. Maybe he drowned in the marshes trying to reach freedom. Maybe he joined maroon communities hidden in swamps. His fate is a void, and that void became part of his power. A man who cannot be found cannot be punished, and cannot be fully controlled even in death. The social cost of his act was uneven but real. It spurred harsher laws, yes, but also revealed cracks in the regime. Fear among masters proved that domination was not invincible. For the enslaved, that knowledge, even whispered, mattered. It meant the system could be defied, however briefly. That seed of possibility travels far. Looking back, the aftermath shows how societies try to contain rebellion. They rewrite it as insanity, punish the community, tighten laws, and then forget. Yet memory survives wherever people need it. In Mobile's case, the erasure worked on paper, but failed in hearts and songs. Abram's name lived on quietly because it spoke to pain and dignity no decree could erase. This section is the long shadow after the night itself. Fear in white households, hope and caution among the enslaved. A city doubling its chains while unable to shake unease. Abram's body may have vanished, but his absence remained. A hole in the story of control that no one could quite fill. Time has a way of sanding down events it finds inconvenient. Mobile grew, traded, and eventually fell to Union troops. The Civil War ended slavery, Reconstruction rose and fell, and Jim Crow built new cages. Through each era, the official record of Abram S. Knight shrank until it was almost nothing. A missing page in a courthouse file, a half sentence in an old merchant's diary. For White Mobile, that was success, an unsettling event transformed into a harmless footnote. But memory lives where paper cannot. Among black families, especially those whose ancestors worked the docks, the story of Abram did not die. It passed from elder to child as a quiet parable that a man once refused the chains that crushed him. Each retelling changed with the times. In some versions, he was a heroic freedom seeker, slipping onto a ship and vanishing into liberation. In others, he died in the marsh, but not before striking a blow for dignity. In every telling, he was not broken. When the Works Progress Administration interviewed former slaves in the 1930s, fragments surfaced. One man, asked about Mobile, said, "There was one who run after standing up to his master, name of Abram, never seen no more." Another recalled songs about a river crossing where chains fall quiet. Scholars largely dismissed these as legend because the archives were thin. Yet the consistency across families suggests something real happened, something people needed to remember. What matters is not whether Abram reached freedom or perished, it is that his story outlived the efforts to erase it. In a world built to crush individuality, he became an individual again, not just property, but a person whose choices left a mark. His resistance, however brief, traveled across generations like a faint but steady drumbeat. You are more than the system says you are. This is also a lesson in how power manages history. The erasure of Abram's name shows a pattern repeated throughout slave societies. When rebellion erupts, smother it quickly, call it madness, seal the record. This protects those in charge and denies the oppressed any examples of defiance. Yet oral culture subverts that strategy. Songs, stories, and whispered memory rebuild what paper tries to burn. Abram's name survived because people needed it to. His legacy also forces a deeper moral reckoning. It is easy to romanticize rebellion, harder to face its cost. Abram likely knew that acting would put his life in grave danger. His choice came not from fantasy, but from despair, a point where endless humiliation, threat of sale, and stripped humanity left nothing but risk. To honor him is not to glorify violence, but to see the cruelty that made him feel he had no other path. Today, telling Abram's story is part of repairing a record built to hide resistance. It complicates the myth that enslaved people were passive or content. It also complicates easy heroism. His act was desperate and dangerous, not clean or victorious. But it was human. It insists that enslaved people were thinkers, agents, and when cornered, capable of saying no at unimaginable cost. Walking the streets of modern Mobile, little hints remain. The river still carries ships past old cotton warehouses. Some of the houses where men like Harper lived survive under new paint. Tour guides rarely mention the night one enslaved man slipped their grip. Yet the silence feels deliberate, an echo of the original effort to contain the story. Listening for what is missing becomes its own form of remembrance. Abram's tale matters now because it cracks the polished surface of history. It shows how ordinary cruelty can build until a person breaks the expected pattern. It warns what systems of dehumanization can provoke. And it honors the unnamed, those who endured quietly and those who, like Abram, risked everything to stop enduring. Nearly 2 centuries on, the night he disappeared is still a void in Mobile's written history. But for those willing to look beyond the archives, it is not empty. It is filled with songs, whispers, and the quiet power of a man who decided he would no longer be only a name in someone else's ledger.